Okay, so we're going to get started. Good afternoon. I know it's been a long day and you guys probably can't wait to go home. So we're going to get through this together and I hope that you find it interesting. We're going to be talking about autism and I'd like you to think about some of the things that I'm going to say during the presentation because I'm going to ask you some questions at the end. Keep you alert, like the teachers do. I'm going to give you an exit ticket, a question like, did you learn something new? Okay, nothing too tough. Okay? So we're going to get started. And many of us have been personally touched by autism in our families. My nephew is on the spectrum. He's what used to be considered high functioning. He graduated from college, got a master's degree. But it took a lot of work. My sister was a single parent. And it took the entire family to work together to get him to where he is today. Many of you might be touched with autism in your families, your neighbors, just working. So as we go through the information, it'll be helpful to you in all areas, not only work, but with your families. So I'm going to talk a little bit about me. That's me over there in the little circle of yellow, how I started in 1982. I was an aide in a school in Queens. I graduated college as a psychology major and didn't know what I wanted to do, so worked for a agency finding jobs for people. A little odd since I couldn't find one for myself, but I was helping other people get jobs. And I decided I wanted to work with people, and I saw an ad for an aide in a special ed school in Queens, and I took the job. And I was in a class of 12 students, 2 aides, and a teacher. Back in 1982, I would say that 10 of those students were on the spectrum. Except back in 1982, they didn't call it that. The diagnosis was MR, mental retardation, which today is intellectually disabled. So all of these students, when we talk about the prevalence of autism and why it's increasing, think about that in 1982, this class of 12, at least 10 of them today would have been diagnosed on the spectrum. So I started out as an aide, then I had my kids, I went back to school and got my master's in special education. Went back to the same school as a teacher for 5 or 6 years, then I did early intervention, and then I began working at Stony Brook where I am today, and I am a behavior consultant for children on the spectrum. So Farmingdale contracts me from Stony Brook Psychiatric Department. So this is my journey, and I started out, and it just hit me, working with kids on the spectrum, although I didn't know at the time that's what they would have been diagnosed with. So what is autism spectrum disorder? They call it ASD as well, if you hear ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and it's called a spectrum disorder because people with ASD can have a range of symptoms. Individuals have a variety of strengths and difficulties. So many of the students that you see and work with, you can see the difference with the diagnosis. You have high-functioning kids or the kids in the 611 classes. So you can see that there's a wide range of abilities and disabilities. And if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person. And that's something that the autism community has used as a statement. Not everybody is the same. First and foremost, they're children. Their diagnosis is secondary to that. Everybody is different, and we have to recognize that. There are weaknesses and strengths in all the kids, and that's what we play to. We try to help them become the best that they can become. So right now, we're going to meet one person on the spectrum. This is Donald Triplett. He was born in 1933. Keep in mind 1933 as we go through the story. In 1933, he was born, and his parents noticed that he was different. He became case number 1 and will be 90 this year. He is the first person that was diagnosed with autism in 1933. Keep that in mind when you're asking why is there so many more children today being diagnosed with autism. He was demonstrating the same types of behaviors back in, 1933. So Donald Triplett was the first known person, and at age 3, his doctors, his parents, took him to doctors, and they said, put him in an institution. Now that's what they did with children in 1933. And they listened. They took him and they placed him in the institution, and they didn't think it was where he should be, you know, a year later. They were like, this is not where we want our child. And they took him to Dr. Leo Kanner, who was a psychiatrist, who diagnosed him in 1943 with autism. But, so look at the, you know, all these years going through, and he was diagnosed at age 5, and how did autism come to be called autism? Many of you might, you know, wonder, where did that name come from? So the term comes from Greek autos, meaning self. And it was first used by a Swiss psychiatrist named Eugene Bleuler, who used it to describe schizophrenia patients that were within themselves. And Leo Kanner, who was discovering autism, decided to take that term and applied it to what he saw, because many of the kids back then that were demonstrating these behaviors were locked into their own world. So that's how he came up with the term autism. So Donald Triplett, what were the behaviors that he was demonstrating? He demonstrated savant abilities. I don't know whether people have seen Rain Man and that had those abilities. There are many people on the spectrum that have, not all people, but there's a percentage of people that have these abilities to do math. He demonstrated music. He could hear a tune and play it without any instruction. He also had rapid mental multiplication. He was able to do that. So he had an interest in number patterns, letters, and US presidents. His language was unusual. He didn't play with other children. He had difficulty eating. He was spinning blocks, pans, and round objects, and had meltdowns. And he also had something called echolalia, which is when the children repeat phrases over and over again. Has anybody seen that with the kids that you work with? So these were the traits that they were seeing in the 1930s. So again, remembering, it's not like autism came out of nowhere. It has existed. He stood on tables, he put food in his hair, he chewed on paper, he repeated words he had learned from the encyclopedia, he communicated only when he needed something, and he categorized Time magazine by date of publication. These were the behaviors that the parents were reporting to the doctor. And this Dr. Leo Kanner was seeing similar behaviors in other children, and he was starting to see a pattern, and that these children existed. So some of these behaviors, some of you have seen with kids, but it's interesting because when we look back at the kids back then, the things that they were doing, like categorizing the magazines, today it's all the computer. They're obsessed with the computer. And years ago it was maps and them memorizing, encyclopedias, because that's all they had. But now they have so much more with the internet and the computers. So what happened to this first case? He went to high school in the community. He graduated college with a degree in French from a college that was not in his town, so he went away to college. And he returned and he worked in the bank in his small town that was owned by his family. And he learned to drive, and he traveled the world. Now, Donald Triplett's family was very wealthy in the town, and it was a very small town, and they embraced him. And everybody took care of him. So when he was working in the bank, he knew everybody used that bank in town, and his world became bigger because people embraced him. But had he not had that opportunity, had his parents not taken him out of that institution, he would have been that typical looking autistic child sitting in a corner rocking, spinning the things that he spun and doing the behaviors that he did when he was little. But because of the intervention his parents provided for him, he had a full life. So this is the book that was written about him. It's called In a Different Key, and it's written by Karen Zucker and John Donovan. And she has a son on the spectrum, and she wanted to meet case number 1, who was the first person diagnosed with autism. And she searched him out, and she had her son who's on the spectrum meet him, and she wrote this book. And there's a documentary on PBS. If you Google it, you'd be able to, see it. And it's just very fascinating to see how autism has been here and has been around for a long time. And we're going to go into more detail about autism and special education. So thinking about this Donald Triplett, who was born in 1933 and was the case number 1 of autism, special ed didn't start until 1975. Children before this law was passed, they didn't have to be educated. So he was born in 1933. It took until 1975 for the laws to be passed to include these children and to make sure that they got an education. That's saying a lot. And many of the children that you work with would have been placed in institutions. And then in 1990, the law was passed, the least restrictive environment. And that means that there are many different environments. So you know that we have a 611 here. We have a 1211, a 15, an ICT. So it's finding the environment that's least restrictive for that student. So before 1975, the government placed no requirements on schools to educate those with disabilities. Most children were kept at home, or the family had to pay for private education. How many people could afford to do that? Not many. So they were home. Many schools had laws actually excluding students who were physically disabled. I don't know if any of you got to see the speaker that was here last week. He did a assembly for the 6th grade students. He's been here many years. He was born with his legs shorter, and he does a whole presentation with the kids and shows them, he wears his prosthetics, and then he shows them through perseverance and everything he did. And it was really very interesting because he touched on this, and he said when he was born and had this, that he was probably my age, around 65, he wasn't allowed to go to school because and his mind was fine. He had a physical disability. So can you imagine him staying home? Of course, his mother fought for him to go to school, and she found the elementary school principal and told him the story he tells that he, got into school because of his mom. But think about it, it's not that far away that these laws came. So examples of autism in the media, it's been very, in the media. People are now talking about it, movies, characters, and TV shows. So we have Rain Man, which was the very beginning. How many of you have seen that movie? Okay, so that's, like we said, one person with autism, you've got one person. He was the stereotype when that movie came out, and everybody just thought that that was what autism looked like. And we know now, children are quite different than people. Atypical on Netflix, I highly recommend. You love it? So, as some of the things I'm talking about, yeah, he's obsessed with his penguins. I highly recommend it. It really shows the person that wrote the TV show. The actor isn't actually on the spectrum, but whoever wrote it has, autism in the family and is very accurately portrayed. Temple Grandin on HBO. Love on the Spectrum, I highly recommend also on Netflix. They have a US and in Australia, and it's young adults finding love on the spectrum. And Young Sheldon on CBS. Oh yeah. And of course, The Big Bang Theory.
I watch it.
Yeah, he's definitely, cracks me up. So these shows I highly recommend if you want to pursue any, watching any of that. So let's talk about the prevalence. Everybody wants to know about why there's so much autism now. In March 2022, about 1 in 44 have been identified on the spectrum. 4 times more common in boys than girls. So we look at this and we talk about when I showed you my class picture when I was an aide in 1982. Let's go back to that picture. I said I had 12 students in my class in 1982. And out of the 12 students, 10 of them most likely were on the spectrum, but we diagnosed, they were labeled as MR, mentally retarded. That's intellectual disability. So as we see this diagnosis going down, children are being diagnosed with autism, with intellectual disability as a subset. So that comes, a lot of numbers are increased in the diagnosis just by that alone. The other thing is better diagnosis. Over the years, we've learned to pick up on those quirky kids that are very high functioning, but they're on the spectrum. So they add into those totals as well. So there are many reasons why. And one of them is vaccines, that people think that it's a vaccine, and it's not. It's been studied. How many of you have heard that? That's been around in the press. It was, you know, scientific studies, tons of money poured into autism, and there has been no correlation. It's actually, and we'll talk about, found to be genetic. So there are many families that have not vaccinated second and third children because their first child was found to be on the spectrum, and their second and third are, you know, are also on the spectrum. So that is not. So we're going to talk about the overview of autism. What causes it? How is it diagnosed? What are the characteristics? Is there a cure? And the most effective strategies. So like I was saying, it's been found to be genetic and neurobiological. There is no blood test. There is no scan of the brain that can tell you if your child is on the spectrum or not. So how is it diagnosed? It's called the DSM-5, and it's going to be like a questionnaire and a checklist, and the teachers, the parents, teachers can hand in things if doctors request it. The parents have to fill out questionnaires. It's observational. There's no, like I said, blood test. There is no other way. It's through observation. But there's a criteria. So there has to be an impairment of social interaction, poorly developed social skills, impairment of communication, difficulty with expressive and receptive language, and restrictive, repetitive, and stereotype patterns of behavior. So that is the criteria for which they look for. Again, it's a psychiatrist, psychologists, neurologists, I believe, can diagnose it as well. And it's by levels now. Now, maybe you've heard terms before, Asperger's. How many of you have heard that term? That's like very high-functioning, quirky kids. They most likely would be, you know, in regular classes. So they don't use those terms anymore. Now it is levels. So Asperger's probably would have been level 1, requiring support. Level 2 is requiring substantial support. And level 3 is very substantial, which would be like your 611 classes. And that's how they categorize it now. And within autism, it's called comorbidity. You can have other things along with autism. You can have the intellectual disability. You can have anxiety. You can have OCD. You can have medical things such as seizures, allergies, anything, attention deficit, gastro problems, sleep disturbances. You know, once you're diagnosed with autism, you're still just a person that can get many things, but we do see more cases of anxiety, OCD, and intellectual disability along with it. And the characteristics of autism are repetitive behaviors, sensory, language communication, obsessive interests, social interactions, and executive functioning, the mental process that enables us to plan. So we're going to go through all of these. And I want you to keep remembering what you're learning, because at the end I may ask you what you learned that you didn't know. And we'll take questions at the end. So repetitive behaviors. So as I'm going over them, think about the students you work with and what you might see. Arm or hand flapping, finger flapping, rocking or jumping, spinning or twirling, complex body movements, And all of these are known as stimming or self-stimulatory behaviors. So, we all do it. How many of you twirl your hair? How many of you bite your nails? How many of you tap your feet? My daughter shakes her leg when she's anxious, and we can feel the house shaking when she does it. We all do things to soothe ourselves. And what we find is that when we ask high-functioning people on the spectrum, they're able to communicate to us that these things make them feel calmer or better. And oftentimes, we are trying to get the kids not to do it because it looks different than all the other kids around. But if it feels good, it's very hard to get them to stop doing something that feels good and replace it with an appropriate behavior, which is the first thing we try to do, but it doesn't always work. And we as people know not to do it in public. We may do things at home that make us feel good, biting nails, but they don't have perspective taking, and they just do what feels good and don't think about what other people think about them. Sensory. Can anybody make out that figure on the rug? Over here, see a zipper? And that is one of my students who earns to get into a sensory bag. It's stretchy material. We got it from the OT. And he, for some reason, that getting in there, he does his work and he earns to go in there. And then he gets a certain amount of time with the timer on, and he comes out and he's calmer. I know I discovered sleeping with a weighted blanket. Has anybody heard of the weighted blanket? I can't sleep without it now. I take it with me wherever I go if I'm in my car. I mean, obviously can't take it on a plane, it would be too expensive, but weighted wise, but I can't sleep without it. Once I discovered it, it's just very comforting to me feeling that extra weight. So we're going to talk about sensory. So the first one is touch. Certain fabrics may be intolerable to the kids. Tags. I know I was in TJ Maxx recently and saw a sweater I wanted. I thought it was adorable. It was $19.99, perfect, except it had one of those mock turtlenecks, and I hate turtlenecks. But I liked the sweater, and I said, $19.99, I'm taking it, I'm going to go home. Put it on and started stretching it away from my neck. Wouldn't give in. Took the tag off, said I'm keeping it. But I had to continue to get it to a point where it was comfortable for me. There are mornings I put on something and it just bothers me. I don't know if any of you have had that. And I have to change my sweater or my shirt, or the tag has to be cut out. Well, I have the strategies. I take the tag out. I take it off and find something else to wear. But when we think about the kids and something's bothering them, but they don't have expressive language to tell what's bothering, you're going to see a behavior maybe. Maybe you're going to see them getting irritable, but you don't know why. Another sensory is taste. Some children may eat the same thing every day. I know when I'm in the cafeteria, a lot of the aides are very frustrated. He eats a dry bagel every day. Well, he has sensory issues, or maybe he just never explored other foods, and the parents were so happy that he ate a dry bagel and he ate something that they give them the bagel every day. And it's very hard to introduce new foods. And when we see kids just having white pasta every day or the same bag of chips, we have to realize how hard it is for those parents to try to really get them to eat different foods. And when your child doesn't eat, you're just happy that they're going to eat anything. So we have to kind of leave the judgment at the door, because food is one of the biggest issues and it's hard to change. Hearing, humming of the fluorescent lights can be very annoying to kids. Tapping pencil. If, let's say, somebody in the class is making a noise, humming, or that could make one of the other kids go crazy because, they can't deal with it and they don't say, could you please stop? They may jump up and start screaming if they don't have the words to say, this is annoying me. Sight, overly decorated classrooms can be overwhelming and distracting to children. I know when we have kids that mainstream in the elementary school into, let's say, a mainstream class from a 12-1-1, we often take them in and let them experience the room several times before they actually attend the class, for a period or two, so that they can experience it and not be looking around at everything. And smell. Certain odors can be a distraction. I'm highly sensitive to smells. I have a girlfriend that puts on way too much perfume, and if we get in the car together, I have to tell her before I pick her up, don't put your perfume on, So one of the students I worked with in Albany Avenue years ago, he wanted to be in the cafeteria, but he could not take all the different smells. So we asked him, what do you like? And he said, vanilla. His mom sent in hand cream with the scent vanilla, and before he'd go to lunch, he would put it on his hands, and when he started like he was going to choke from the smells of gag, he just smelled his fingers, and that was enough to help him remain in the cafeteria. But again, he wanted it. He was high functioning, he was able to tell us, and he worked with us, and we figured out a plan for him. So all of these issues are underlying their behaviors that you see. It's not, their behaviors are not just happening. Oftentimes it's like, why are they doing this? All of these issues could be at play. One of them could be at play. Then we have the area of language and communication. Children diagnosed on the autism spectrum often have difficulty developing language skills, both expressive and receptive. So that is, receptive is taking in and expressive is speaking. So one example recently that happened, one of my students was in the hallway in middle school, and she was walking to another class, but she saw her health teacher. And she said to her, and she's in a 12-on-1 class, but mainstream's in for health. I hate health, she says to the teacher. Teacher looks at her like, what's the matter? And she just continues walking. So her aide and I asked her, what did you mean to say? We took the time, we got her to express, she didn't do her health homework, and she was nervous to go to health and tell her teacher. But instead, in that moment, she said, I hate health. That was her way of expressing that she had a problem, so she needed time. Her aide, she spoke about it, they role played, and when she went to help, 2 periods later, she approached her teacher and told her, I couldn't do my health homework. So even though she has language, her expressive language skills are delayed to the point where she really needed time to figure out how to say that. But it was all in there. So we always have to give them time to process. Sometimes there's repetitive and rigid language, or they have stock phrases. They're repeating things that they've heard in a video game or on, a movie. They like to talk about narrow interests, and they have exceptionally high vocabulary in those areas, and they sound like they can really speak to you about everything, but they really can only speak about their high interest. And some children may be able to read words, but they don't really comprehend. That's able to decode the words, but they really don't understand what they're reading, which is also, people don't understand that, but those are 2 different skills. Decoding words and actually comprehending are 2 different skills. Many of the kids have obsessive interests, and they can be highly focused when they're young. They can change over time. And Thomas the Tank used to be very popular, specific topics in history, cartoon characters, volcanoes. If you can take those interests and move them into appropriate areas for the kids, it's like talking about Donald Triplett and what he was interested in. He didn't continue to talk about that all the time, but he might have talked about other things with the people that he engaged in at his job. And that's the hope, to move them along into interests that are more age appropriate, so that an adult isn't talking about Thomas the Tank. And then we have the area of social interactions. So pragmatic language is used for social interaction. They go to speech therapy, that they all, have that during the day. Many of them have difficulty. They have language, they can speak. It's not the enunciation of the words, but they don't have the use of language like we do. They're not using it socially. There's also body language and slang that we just learn through, observation, that we take for granted, that we've just learned, that they're not able to understand. They're literal thinkers. They often use a different tone. I don't know if you've ever noticed, they can speak very loudly and they don't realize it, or their tone of voice is different. They have problem solving and expressing their emotions are difficult, and like we talked about, perspective taking. They really don't, many of them, not everybody, understand how other people view their behavior. So they can have a full-out outburst, and they have absolutely no knowledge that people are looking at them or thinking of anything, or that their peers may be afraid of them. So literal thinkers. I want to talk about this a lot because a lot of the kids are very literal. Don't drink and drive. I have a student who was on the Long Island Expressway with his family, and they were driving home, and the sign on the expressway, it says don't drink and drive. Well, his father was drinking water out of a water bottle, and he started screaming, "We're gonna get arrested, don't drink and drive." And, they had to explain, no, that's alcohol. Well, this kid didn't understand that. Now, we all understand it. Did any of you have any difficulty understanding that it meant don't drink alcohol and drive? That would be so, literal for this child. Other things are idioms and multi-word expressions like under the weather. Using expressions like, oh, I feel under the weather. They're going to take it literally. What does that mean? Penny for your thoughts. Don't spill the beans. We're having a surprise party. Don't spill the beans. Don't tell mommy. Spill the beans. They're taking these things so literally that we often don't even think about the English language and how much there is to interpret, because we've all just learned it. But it's almost foreign to them because they're taking it so literally. I had a student who the teacher would stand in front of the room on a Friday and go, "I'm looking at all your desks and they're a mess, and I'm gonna, we're gonna have to do something." Now, typically developing kids would look inside their desk and go, "Mine's clean," and just forget what the teacher is saying. My student looked in, very high-functioning little girl on the spectrum, she looked in, and hers was clean, but she went home hysterical to her parents that the teacher told her her desk was a mess, because she literally took what the teacher said and wasn't able to do that other thinking. So we have to know this when we're engaging with the kids. And social interactions are difficult for them, and many times it appears that they don't want friends, or they're not interested, but they just might not understand what the kids are doing. And I know it's hard to think that, especially with the higher functioning, but I have one child in mind that's very high functioning. She's in middle school, but she really has that pragmatic language difficulty where she doesn't really understand what the girls are talking about. And girls can be really mean in middle school. And there's all this talking that just goes over her head, and yet she's trying to fit in. She's trying to sit there and really look like she's getting it, but she doesn't. She does great with her academics, but that social piece and that social pragmatic language is really her biggest weakness. And it's very difficult for her. And oftentimes with children like that, it leads to anxiety, it leads to depression, because they know that there's a failure there and they don't know what to do about it. And executive functioning. Students may have difficulty with skills like planning, staying organized, and sequencing information and self-regulating their emotions. So one of the things that happens is they can come into class every day in elementary school and still not know how to unpack. They'll still be, by December, they're still just standing there when they walk in the door, because they don't plan. They don't have that planning. And it's called executive functioning. You take it for granted that you plan everything in the morning, how you're going to leave the house, pack up your lunch, what time you have to be there. This is an area of weakness for many kids, and it has to be taught over and over and over again. Sometimes they have visual supports and a list in the morning, in their classroom about what they're supposed to do. Some characteristics can be not remembering things, so a teacher will be like, you didn't bring it in again. Unable to follow the routines, losing possessions, and then the behavioral outbursts because they become frustrated because they can't do what they're supposed to be doing. So what interventions are there for autism? Early intervention begins under 3 years of age. So if you have anybody in your family or any neighbors, if you're seeing difficulty, they're entitled to have an evaluation for speech therapy, OT, PT, and they'll get a full evaluation and they're entitled to services. Then over 3 to 5 is called preschool services, and they have preschools that the kids can go to. There are services for them, or services like, it's called a See It. I used to do that. I'd follow as a special ed teacher. I would go to a regular nursery school, but I would be the one-to-one and help that child integrate into the preschool. So that is crucial. Services for early intervention are crucial for any area of weakness with a child. The earlier you can get to it and remediate it, the better. There's like, if people are saying, oh, I'm gonna wait, it's a boy, boys talk later. No, get the evaluation. It can't hurt. It can only help. Then we have ABA, which is called Applied Behavior Analysis, and that is a highly structured form of teaching one-to-one for children that really need that one-to-one attention. Then we have life skills, functional academics, vocational preparation, higher education when appropriate, positive behavior supports. Many of you see charts that the kids use and visual cues. Those are called positive behavioral supports. Social skills classes that the psychologists run and speech therapists. Then there's OT, PT, and meds. There is no cure for autism. So if you hear any of these actresses that go on TV and say that they've cured their child, you don't cure autism, you lessen the symptoms. So let's think about Donald Triplett and how his symptoms got lessened and he was able to have a productive life. He still has autism, but his symptoms have reduced. So there is no such thing as a cure. And if there was a cure, that child was misdiagnosed. And that happens a lot too. So I'm going to end with, and take your questions, I'm going to end with this visual of the iceberg. Everything we've talked about, the sensory, the language, people, what you see is aggression or a child fleeing or a meltdown. But remember that underneath this iceberg is all of the things that we talked about today. The sensory issues, the language difficulties, the social difficulties, the repetitive behaviors. All of those things are affecting the child that we don't see. And then we see the behaviors occurring. So people that work in the field of autism have to be little detectives to discover what are the things that are affecting the child the most. So teachers are looking for the things and remediating them and helping them to become the best that they can be. And that goes from the children that need the most substantial support, which is the level 3, to the kids level 1. Everybody deserves to be the best they can be, no matter what level that is. It's not like everyone has to go to college. Being productive, happy, and engaged in society is the goal for everybody. And that is what our hope is. So that is my overview of autism. Now I want to hear from you and find out, did you learn anything new from this presentation? The teachers give the students exit tickets. They have to say something that they learned in class. So is there anything you learned?
I learned the sequencing. I didn't realize that they can't sequence like coming into the classroom.
and taking their backpack off and following directions. So yeah, that was interesting.
So that's executive functioning, and it's not every student, but many of them do.
The walk on the tippy toes, is that part of it? The walking on the tippy toes, isn't that?
Yes, well, very often we see the kids walking on their tippy toes, and that is a sensory. And after all this time, there's been so much research, and they don't know why. Did it start as a habit? Now that developmentally is developmentally correct for all little babies. Like my grandchildren, when they started walking, I saw them on their tippy toes. Flapping is developmentally part of growing up, getting happy. I saw my twin grandsons flapping, but they outgrew it. Children on the spectrum don't outgrow it. So, you know, it's only my thought, like if they're stuck in that, you know, stage. Okay, so I got 2. What did you learn?
The 3 levels. I mean, I always knew that it's broad with all of them, but I didn't realize that it was broken down into 3, levels like
Yep.
that.
And they used to call it high functioning and low functioning, but as things develop and they, you know, put things, that's the way they're categorizing it now. Okay, anybody else?
Oh, when you said they take things
Wait,
literally,
they can't hear you.
taking things literally,
Mhm.
not understanding.
Okay, so have you had that happen at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Students.
And oftentimes people can become frustrated by thinking like, they have language, why can't they understand this? But when you think about stroke victims. Has anybody experienced anybody in their family have a stroke? So oftentimes they can't say and communicate, but they can curse really well.
Yeah.
And that curse comes out, you know? So we have to think about the brain and how it's a neurobiological disorder. So it's not only, it's affecting them, you know, that way. Anybody in the back learn anything new that they want to share? No? Yes, wait, I have to.
I have a niece who's on the spectrum, and she's in 11th grade. And the parents get frustrated because they don't know what part of it is her autism and what part of it is a typical teenager. So where would you go for help for that?
Okay, good question. So, first and foremost, they're children. Their diagnosis comes second. So, is she considered high functioning?
Yeah.
High
She
functioning?
doesn't have an aid anymore.
And she doesn't have an aid. So are they could get parent training, and that person, they can ask their school district for parent training, and that person would help them to determine if it's a behavior occurring from her diagnosis, or is it because she's a teenager? So that would be what I would recommend first. Anybody else have any questions? Oh, no, we have a question here.
No question. I just wanted to say thank you guys. I know some of you are nearing your last session for the professional development hours, and I really commend you for your commitment to learning a little bit more about the kids that you work with and about the buildings that you're in and the role that you're in. That was the goal. We're going to continue to look for new topics each year so that you're not cycling unless you want to take the same topic. But I want you to know, Debbie, you were one of the most popular topics that everybody wanted to learn about. So yeah, thank you. Most importantly, for your expertise and for providing us a little bit of empathy for what we see and experience with students on the spectrum or students with autism, because we do encounter it, and it can be frustrating dealing with them. And oftentimes, and in the history that you pointed out, they weren't even able to attend their local school, and we've come a long way with regard to that. As a parent, you would want that for your child, and the number one thing that parents of students with autism want is for them to be normal in a normal setting and to interact with kids in a normal way, and that sometimes never comes. So having an understanding and being able to lead with empathy when dealing with those children is really important for us, and you provided such a perfect picture So thank you, Debbie. Again, you were one of the most popular people that they wanted to present on the topic and the topic itself. So many of our aides are in scenarios and roles where they're supporting students with autism. So thanks again, and again, to all of you guys that are on satellite locations and you guys that are here in the flesh with me, thank you for your commitment in the workshops if you're nearing the end or if today is your last one. Again, this is intentional so that you guys can continue to learn and grow in your role. So thanks again. And Debbie, Gerard, thanks so much. I know you're doing this again in a little while, but you guys are done, so thanks again.